Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Doctors In podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nadia Saba, president and founder of Dr. Greenhouse. Today, I want to talk about mushrooms and what it takes to grow mushrooms in a controlled environment. So, the title today is Five Challenges That Are Unique to Growing Mushrooms in a Controlled Environment. Growing mushrooms indoors is similar in a lot of way to growing green plants indoors. We want to manage heat, moisture, humidity, oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as pests and pathogens. But the variables that we're trying to control, although they are similar, the what or the how and the why can be pretty different. And so that's what I want to talk about today, are those unique differences in growing mushrooms compared to growing plants. Okay, so the first unique challenge is thermal management. When we're growing plants indoors, right, the majority of the heat that comes into any controlled environment is going to be either the lights or the sun that are required to for plants to photosynthesize. Mushrooms don't necessarily need light in order to grow. And therefore, we can actually grow them in the dark. So there is no heat that's being generated or brought into the mushroom growing environment from lighting or the sun. Rather, there is heat generated in the substrate that mushrooms are growing on. So, mushrooms are decomposers. And depending on the type of mushroom, those mushrooms could be primary or secondary decomposers, which really means what is the quality of the raw materials that they are growing on. If we're talking about white button mushrooms or portobello mushrooms, those are secondary decomposers. And so they need compost that's already been broken down by other microorganisms in order to grow and thrive and to access the nutrients that are available in those materials. If we're talking about, say, a shiitake mushroom or an oyster mushroom, those are primary decomposers, and they can just grow straight on the raw materials to decompose those materials into other forms of nutrients. So they might just grow on, say, straw and wheat bran without having a preliminary composting process to break down the nutrients for them. So when the mushrooms are growing, they are, actively breaking down these materials. And they're doing it with oxygen and they're doing it with the moisture that's available. And so they're breaking down these nutrients. And as they do that, they're generating heat. Mushrooms are a lot like animals in that they use oxygen, they're aerobic, and then they generate carbon dioxide and other products, byproducts of respiration. So that's heat, oxygen, and water vapor. Well, that heat, it builds up in the substrate, and it can get really hot in there if we don't have a way to cool it down. So the way that we cool it down, typically just like we would in an indoor farm growing plants, is that we cool the air around the substrate so that the heat will want to transfer from that growing substrate, to a place of lesser heat concentration, which would then be the air. So in order to prevent the compost from overheating, we want that heat to then move to the air. But the trick is that we actually want the substrate to stay a little warm, because the warmth actually helps to, maintain and facilitate bioactivity and growth, just like us, right? If we're outside in the summer, right, like we tend to be more active up to a point. Maybe, 110 degrees might not be very active, but right, if it's 80, 90 degrees, a sunny day, right, we tend to be more active than when it's really cold out, which it is right now. You're right. We're approaching winter. It's the fall right now. Temperatures are dropping and we tend to be less active. So same thing with mushrooms, is that we want that heat to have a place to go, but we don't want it to be so cool that we reduce the bioactivity of those mushrooms, as well as the other microorganisms that are in that compost, continuing to help break down, the raw materials into usable forms of nutrients that those mushrooms can grow on. So, you know, at the same time, the mushrooms themselves, you might know, right? Like other molds, they kind of like it to be cool and damp, right? And one of the reasons why the mushrooms like sort of a cool environment is because they are also evaporating water from the surfaces, right, of their little fruiting bodies. And so if it gets too dry or it gets too warm, then they might evaporate more water, right, quickly than they can pull it up with their mycelia from the substrate below, and then they could dry out or desiccate. So mushroom growers have this really big challenge of balancing not just how much heat we want to remove, right? We don't just want to remove how much heat is generated from the substrate. We also want to maintain some of the heat in the substrate. So it's not quite a one-to-one balance like you might see in an indoor farm and the air that we're managing and growing plants. We want some heat to stay in that substrate, and we want to dissipate other heat so that that substrate doesn't overheat and the mushrooms themselves don't overheat and desiccate. Okay, so the second challenge that mushroom farmers have to face is moisture management. So, what's really interesting about growing mushrooms commercially is that we grow them in this substrate that is basically pre-processed before we ever add any mushroom spawn, also seed, to that substrate. And so we have these raw materials. Maybe we went through an initial primary decomposing process to make those nutrients available, right? And so we have this substrate, these nutrients, but we also have to add water to that substrate. And what's so unique about growing mushrooms is that all the water that the mushrooms are going to use during their entire growth cycle, we have to provide in that substrate at the very beginning when we're mixing that substrate. There is no irrigating later. There is no, fertigation later. The nutrients and the water that we give them today is what's going to be available for them tomorrow and in 2 months from now when we make our final harvest. So managing moisture is really important in order to, contain some of that moisture inside the substrate so that it's still available and prevent it from evaporating too quickly. It's nice that mushrooms like to grow in sort of a humid environment, because that's going to help prevent some of that evaporation from both the substrate and the mushroom. But we also don't want so much moisture that it rains, and we don't want so little moisture that we create not just a lot of evaporation from the substrate, but also from the mushrooms. So managing moisture is super unique to commercial mushroom production, in that we just give them water one time and that's it. So we have to get it right from the beginning. Okay, the third challenge that mushroom producers face is carbon dioxide management. So that sounds familiar for those of you who are growing plants, right? We want to manage carbon dioxide. Plants are photosynthesizing, so we have to feed them carbon dioxide. That's basically their source of carbon in order to fix and then produce the sugars and the building blocks for growth. But with mushrooms are respiring organisms. They're more like us than like plants, in that they use oxygen and breathe carbon dioxide. So in order to manage CO2, we actually want to ventilate so that the mushrooms can breathe in oxygen. But the thing is that we don't always want an oxygen rich environment for mushrooms to grow. One of the tricks that mushroom growers use is they actually allow the carbon dioxide level to to increase over time while the mycelia are all rooting around in the substrate and before there are any mushrooms coming up through that substrate and growing. And so what happens is that, those mushroom mycelia, they're using the oxygen that's in the air, that it's available right in the substrate. It's generating CO2. That CO2 is leaving the substrate. It's filling up the room that the mushrooms are growing in. And then it just stays there. The growers do not vent out that carbon dioxide. This is 100% recirculating air system because that CO2 suppresses mushrooms from wanting to pop up the surface. So essentially, growers are allowing this elevated CO2 level to occur in order to push the mycelia to keep colonizing the substrate and become really robust and have this really thick white, mass of mycelia that colonizes throughout and is going to produce really robust mushrooms. I mean, I'm not kidding. When I say elevated CO2 levels, I mean, some of your guys' hearts are going to stop when you hear this right now. It can be 5,000 or 6,000 parts per million CO2 in a mushroom house before a mushroom ever pops out of the ground. And so then what happens is like now you get this really dense mycelial thicket inside the substrate. And then the grower says, okay, now I want mushrooms to pop up. Now I want them to fruit. And so then they just open up the vents. They release all that CO2. They bring in all this fresh outside air. And the mushrooms, they just take a deep breath and they just start pinning. They just start popping up everywhere because they built up all this energy, right? And they've just been waiting to burst out literally of this casing. And as soon as there's enough oxygen to do so, they just bust out and you see mushrooms everywhere. So when it comes to mushrooms, we want elevated CO2 sometimes in order to suppress growth, right? Actually, we're encouraging growth underneath the surface, but we're suppressing the growth that would come up above the surface, right? The fruiting bodies that we're eventually going to harvest and then sell and eat. And then they use oxygen, right, to then allow those mushrooms to breathe and grow and develop. So very unique way to manage carbon dioxide in a growing environment, especially as compared to growing green plants. Okay, the fourth challenge to growing mushrooms commercially is odor management. Now, those of you listening who are in the cannabis industry, this probably feels pretty familiar to you. Odors are a huge issue when it comes to growing mushrooms, especially because that compost is kind of stinky. It is an endeavor, that requires a lot of microorganism activity and they're generating, right, their waste byproducts, and one of them is ammonia. If you're doing it right and you're aerating the compost, then those microorganisms will be aerobic and they'll produce ammonia, which is kind of, a sweet smell that might remind you of urine. And mushroom growers will tell you it smells like money. But their neighbors will tell you it smells like a porta potty. But just to put this in perspective too, if you're composting wrong, the smell you're going to get is rotten eggs, that sulfur dioxide smell. That is way worse, I would say, probably to anyone listening, I expect, than the smell of ammonia. So we definitely want to avoid the rotting egg smell. We want more of that sweet ammonia smell. But it's still considered a nuisance odor, right, to neighbors. And a lot of these mushroom farms have been in existence for 50, 60, 80 years, a really long time. And, back then they were way out in the country, right? Rural Pennsylvania, rural Ohio. Nobody really was paying attention to the odors. But now, right, as people are moving away from the city and they're encroaching on, these rural areas, they're, stumbling upon mushroom farms and composting facilities and processing facilities that have chicken manure and horse manure and stinky stuff. And so they're of course complaining about the smell. And so, some of the tactics that mushroom growers are employing are things that, cannabis growers are trying. They're lining their property with trees to try to knock down some of those odors before it can leave the property, or absorb them or mask them even. Some of them are using those chemical sprays to mask the odors. And some of these farms have water retention ponds, right? Because they have runoff from the compost and from the substrate. And so those water retention ponds, if they go anaerobic, they also will produce sulfur dioxide. And so, a lot of, these producers will line them and provide aeration so that it stays aerobic and is producing really primarily that ammonia smell. And, at least producing a less offensive odor than if it went anaerobic. But this is a real issue. And I even remember when I was at Penn State 20 plus years ago studying my master's degree, they were doing sniff tests. I remember they had like compost and they had spent mushroom substrate in a container, in a shipping container, and they had a little opening and they had like a sniff testing panel, and people would come by and they would like, open the little panel and smell it and then write down what they, notes, like what they thought the level of offense was and what smell they smelled, etc. So 25 years on, we are still dealing with these issues. And quite honestly, I'm not sure that even the technology has caught up to the challenge. And we know that that's true for cannabis as well. Okay, so the fifth challenge, again, this is going to sound really familiar to our indoor plant growers, is pest management. Oh my goodness. Flies, flies, and more flies. This was the issue of the day when I was at Penn State short course back in October. Flies are really one of the biggest challenges that are, if I may say this, pestering mushroom farmers. We have phorid flies, which seem to be super prevalent. It's the fly that every mushroom grower, especially on the East Coast, is really trying to abate. They seem to be attracted during the spawn run, during the mycelia growth, and they think that maybe the mycelia are generating some odors. Maybe it's that breakdown of ammonia to ammonium nitrate and then back to ammonia that's, catching the attention of flies coming from miles, hundreds of miles away. And they seem to find these mushroom farms that are at this very specific stage of mushroom growth. And so they think, well, this must be an odor, a VOC that's being emanated from these farms and compost facilities that's attracting them. Because what else, could it be? And so, there's a lot of research going on right now to try to figure out how can we limit or avoid phorid flies from showing up on our property. And then there's also the ciliate fly, which apparently is more prevalent here on the West Coast. Seems to be more attracted to the composting process than the mushroom growing process. And the other pest that to me always seems so obvious when we're growing mushrooms are molds. Here we are, we're creating this perfect environment to grow mushrooms, right? Which is a fungus, a mold. And we have this cool, damp condition, right? The substrate that's super nutrient dense. And why wouldn't other fungi want to come in and be and crash the party, and get a free lunch. And they do. And so, trichoderma green mold is one that's really common throughout the country that growers have to deal with. And maybe you can cut it right out of the substrate. But then you lose, like you might be able to prevent that green mold from spreading, but then you might lose that area as a productive area for your mushrooms. And there are many other molds that are associated with growing mushrooms, honestly, that are very unique to mushrooms that I don't see in green plant environments. But same story is true, right? we've been trying to manage pests since the dawn of the agricultural revolution, and mushrooms are no exception to that challenge. So so that's it. Those are the 5 challenges that mushroom growers, are faced with every day. Managing heat, right? Managing the thermal environment, managing moisture, managing carbon dioxide and oxygen, managing, uh odor, and managing pests and pathogens. Those are the 5 uh, biggest challenges, at least that I know of, for growing mushrooms. Of course, there are many others that we can go through, but I just find those so fascinating because in the majority of our work, we're dealing or working with growers and clients who are trying to grow green plants. And you could list these same 5 challenges for an indoor farm or greenhouse growing lettuce or tomatoes or berries or cannabis. It just might be that the suspects are not as usual as growing green plants as with mushrooms. So those are the 5 challenges. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast and video. And till next time, have a great one.